Is that panic in his voice or relief? That was the only thing I could ask myself as I watched my son's face turn white on live television, 3 feet from where I stood holding a fire extinguisher I'd just used to save a man's life. Nobody in that crowd knew who I was yet. 20 minutes earlier, all I'd wanted was somebody, anybody, to answer a simple text. My name is Walter Pruitt, and this is the night my own children finally learned what silence costs. I need to back up, because none of this makes sense unless you understand where I was standing 4 hours before the cameras showed up. I'm 69 years old. I spent 38 years working the line at a freight yard outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, moving cargo nobody thought about twice, keeping schedules running so other people's lives could happen on time. My wife, Carol, used to joke that I was the most reliable man in 3 counties and the most forgettable one too, because nobody remembers the man who made sure the trains ran. They just remember that the trains ran. I never minded that. Some men need to be seen. I only ever needed to be needed, and for 41 years, Carol needed me, and our children needed me, and that was enough. Carol passed in March. Pancreatic cancer, the kind that gives you just enough warning to say everything and never enough time to actually say it. She spent her last 6 weeks in a hospice outside Allentown, near her sister, because that facility had a nurse Carol trusted, a woman named Rosa who used to sing to her in Spanish when the pain medication made the nights too long. I drove the 2 hours out there, 4, sometimes 5 times a week. Some visits she knew me. Some visits she called me by her father's name, and I answered to it anyway, because by then I understood that being loved by someone isn't always about being recognized by them. It's about showing up regardless. The morning she died, I was holding her hand, and Rosa was humming something low in the corner, and the machines just stopped their argument with each other and went quiet. I remember thinking the quiet was the worst sound I'd ever heard. If you've ever sat in a room and watched somebody's whole future collapse down into stillness, you know there's no bracing for that moment. It arrives exactly when it wants to, and it doesn't ask permission. The funeral was in Scranton, small, the way Carol always said she wanted it. She hated fuss. No long line of cars, no expensive flowers, just the people who actually loved her and the hymns she'd sung in the church choir for 30 years. I stood at that graveside afterward until the funeral director, a kind man named Julio, gently told me the ground crew needed to finish before the rain came in. I told him I understood, but honestly, I didn't understand anything that day. I flew back out to Allentown 2 days later to collect the last of Carol's things from the hospice, because Rosa had asked if I could come get them before the room was needed for someone else, and I couldn't say no to that woman after everything she'd done for my wife. That's the part of this story most people skip past too fast when they hear it later, so let me slow down here. I flew home that evening, one small suitcase and Carol's overnight bag, the same blue duffel she'd carried to every hospital visit for a year. I landed at Wilkes-Barre, Scranton, a little after 6. I sat in my seat while everybody else filed off ahead of me, because for the first time in 41 years, nobody in the world was standing at that gate waiting for me. I opened the family group chat once I'd cleared the jet bridge. Me, my son Gary, my daughter Michelle, Gary's wife Priya, and a scattering of cousins who mostly posted grandchildren's birthday photos. I typed, "Landed. Long day. Could one of you swing by and grab me?" I sat there staring at that message longer than I want to admit before I hit send, because in 41 years I had never once needed to ask my own children for a ride anywhere, and something in me already knew how it was going to feel to ask now. Gary answered first. "Kinda in the middle of something, Dad. Uber's like $12 from there." Michelle answered 2 minutes later. "You know Thursdays are always packed for me, right? Next time text earlier so we can actually plan around it. $12, plan around it." As though grief kept office hours. As though burying your mother's overnight bag from a hospice room was something you were supposed to fit neatly around somebody's Thursday. I could have told them exactly where I'd just been. I could have said I'd spent the last 2 hours folding your mother's nightgowns into a duffel bag while a hospice nurse cried in the hallway because she'd grown to love her too. Instead, I typed back 2 words. No problem. Then I put the phone in my coat pocket, not because it actually was no problem, but because somewhere in that terminal, standing alone under the fluorescent lights, I finally understood something Carol had tried gently to tell me for years. You cannot make people show up. You can only decide what you do with the space they leave behind. Outside, Scranton greeted me with the kind of thin, cold rain that doesn't soak you so much as it just settles into your bones. Families were hugging at the curb, horns blaring, ordinary chaos, completely indifferent to the fact that my whole life had quietly come apart somewhere over Pennsylvania that afternoon. I wheeled my suitcase and Carol's duffel toward the parking garage because I'd decided I'd rather pay for the extended lot and drive myself than sit in the back of a stranger's car crying, which I already knew I was close to doing. Near the garage elevator, a young mother was wrestling two kids and a car seat and a stroller all at once, and her husband was nowhere in sight. I set my bags down and helped her load the car seat, and she thanked me twice and said something about how her own father would have done the same thing. I told her I hoped somebody would do the same for her someday when she needed it. That's when the ground under all of us seemed to jump. A delivery truck had lost its brakes coming down the ramp from the upper level, and it clipped a minivan that spun sideways into a support column, and behind that minivan a sedan couldn't stop in time. Metal on metal, that scream you never forget once you've heard it. Smoke started rising almost immediately from the crumpled hood of the sedan, and I could smell gasoline before I even saw the flame catch. People around the garage froze. Some pulled out phones. Somebody grabbed my sleeve and told me to get back, that it might go up any second. I pulled free before I even decided to. 22 years earlier, before the freight yard promoted me into an office, I'd spent 3 years on a volunteer fire crew in the town where Carol and I first lived, back when we were young and broke, and I needed the extra stipend more than I needed sleep. Structural fires, vehicle extractions, the training you take because you need the money and pray you never actually need the skill. Instinct got there before fear could vote on anything. I ran toward the sedan. A teenage boy was slumped against the driver's door, stunned, blood running from a cut above his eyebrow, and the flames were licking up from under the hood fast now, faster than I liked. Someone screamed that the truck driver was still trapped in the cab of the delivery truck, unconscious, pinned. I grabbed a fire extinguisher off the garage wall bracket, the kind bolted up near every third pillar that everybody walks past every single day and never actually looks at, and I put myself between that flame and the truck cab, and I emptied the whole canister into the engine well, and when that wasn't enough, I grabbed the second one off the next pillar down and finished the job. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think this is the part people rush past too quickly when they hear a story like this. Nobody standing there that day would have called me brave to look at me. I'm an old man with a bad hip and reading glasses I forget in my shirt pocket half the time. But courage in that parking garage wasn't a decision I made. It was just what was left over once grief had already burned away everything in me that used to be afraid of anything. Carol had spent 6 weeks teaching me, without ever meaning to, that fear is a luxury you can only afford when you've still got something left to lose that scares you more than losing her already did. 2 firefighters reached the truck cab right as the flames finally died down to smoke, and they pulled the driver out, breathing, concussed but alive. A paramedic knelt beside me afterward and asked if I was hurt, and I told her just my hands, a little scorched at the knuckles, nothing serious. She asked if family was coming to get me. I told her they were busy tonight. She didn't push. She just wrapped my hands and told me she hoped somebody was taking me home safe. So did I. A police sergeant with a notepad asked my name for his report. Walter Pruitt, I told him, 69. He looked at me a beat too long, the way people do when the math of what just happened doesn't match the man standing in front of them. You should let them check you out at the hospital, he said. I've had worse days, I told him, and he almost smiled until I added, without really meaning to, buried my wife 3 days ago. His smile disappeared entirely, and he just nodded and wrote something down and didn't ask anything else. A reporter had already made her way over by then, a local anchor named Teresa Alvarado, who covers the Scranton-Wilkes-Barre area for the CBS affiliate, camera operator trailing a few steps behind her. She asked if I'd answer a couple of questions. I told her honestly I wasn't in the mood. She said witnesses were telling her I'd gone back for the second extinguisher on my own, that the responding units only got there in time to save the truck driver because I'd bought them the minutes they needed. I told her I was just glad everybody made it out, and that was all I really wanted to say. She nodded, thanked me, and to her credit, she actually let it go, at least for the moment. Carol always did respect people who knew how to accept no without turning it into an argument. Because the garage stayed closed off for hours while the fire marshal finished his inspection, a friend of the sergeant's, an off-duty officer named Hal, offered to drive me the 15 minutes to a highway motel so I wouldn't be standing around in the cold all night. I checked into a room with the kind of beige carpet you find in every interstate exit town in America, set Carol's blue duffel bag on the dresser, and sat down on the edge of the bed and finally let myself cry. Not for the fire, not for my hands. For the fact that there would never again be a phone call from Carol asking if I'd landed safe. Across town, my son Gary was halfway through dinner with Priya and their two boys when his phone started buzzing. A neighbor first, then a guy from his softball league, then his own supervisor at the insurance office where he worked. "Turn on channel 16, his supervisor said, and hung up before Gary could ask why. The footage was already looping by the time he got the television on, a gray-haired man in a scorched jacket pointing firefighters toward a burning truck cab. Priya went pale before Gary had even fully processed what he was looking at. "Gary," she said quietly. "Is that your father?" His throat closed up completely, and he couldn't answer her. Across the city, my daughter Michelle got almost the identical call from her coworker Danielle. "I think your dad is all over the news right now," Danielle said. Michelle laughed it off at first, the way you do when something sounds too strange to be real, until she turned on the television herself and had to sit straight down on her kitchen floor. Then the anchor read a detail on air that stopped her cold. Walter Pruitt had reportedly flown in from Allentown earlier that evening after collecting his late wife's belongings from hospice, following her funeral just days prior. Michelle sat there with her hand over her mouth because she had been so buried in her own Thursday, in carpool lines and quarterly deadlines, that she hadn't spared even one thought for what that lonely flight home must have actually felt like for her own father. I want to pause here, because I think this moment matters more than the fire itself. Most people like to believe they'd never say something as careless as Ubers, like $12, to a parent who'd just buried their mother. But neglect rarely knocks and announces itself as neglect. It just quietly reroutes your attention somewhere else, toward your own Thursday, your own softball league, your own quarterly numbers, until a stranger's camera forces you to finally look at what you'd stopped looking at on your own. My phone stayed face down on that motel nightstand the whole night. I never felt it buzzing. Didn't see the calls stacking up, 40-some of them by morning, everybody suddenly urgently wanting to know where I was, now that it was too late for it to feel the way it should have felt 12 hours earlier. I woke a little before 6. For a few peaceful seconds I forgot everything. Forgot I was in a motel and not my own bed. Forgot Carol was gone. Forgot the fire, the smoke, the smell of gasoline still clinging faintly to my jacket on the chair. Then I reached over toward the other half of the mattress and found only cold sheets, and it all came crashing back down at once, the whole weight of it, all over again. I left the television off. I'd spent 38 years quietly keeping freight trains running on schedule and slipping out the back door before anybody could make a fuss about it, and recognition had never once been the point for me, not once in my whole life. Around 8:30, there was a knock at the door. It was Teresa Alvarado, the reporter, looking almost embarrassed to be there. The motel clerk had recognized me from the broadcast. She said she wasn't there to push a microphone in my face again. She just had a message. The truck driver, a father of 3 named Desmond, was stable and expected to make a full recovery, and his wife wanted me to know he'd been asking for the name of the man who put the fire out. I actually laughed for the first time in days. I told Teresa I hoped somebody was also telling Desmond never to drive down that ramp again without checking his brakes first. She smiled and told me there were a dozen reporters camped outside already. I asked her to keep my location to herself. She gave me her word, and for the first time since any of this started, I believed there was still such a thing as a reporter with some decency left in her. Meanwhile, Gary and Michelle met outside my house that morning using the spare key I'd given Gary years back for emergencies. Everything sat exactly the way I'd left it before I flew out. Carol's reading chair angled toward the window, my work boots lined up by the garage door, no smell of coffee, because for 39 years she'd always beaten me out of bed to make a pot before I even opened my eyes. Michelle noticed a small dish on the side table filled with dried rose petals, the last bouquet I'd bought Carol for our anniversary, and she stood there a long moment without saying anything at all. "We should straighten up before Dad gets home," Michelle finally said, mostly, I think now, because it gave her hands something to do besides shake. While she was dusting the hallway shelf, she found an old cardboard file box tucked behind winter coats in the closet that neither of them had ever really noticed before. Inside were bank statements, old letters, and a stack of spiral notebooks, each one labeled by year in Carol's careful handwriting. "I don't think we should read these," Michelle said. "I think Mom would want us to," Gary answered, though he admitted afterward he wasn't sure either. The early entries were ordinary: birthdays, small complaints about neighbors, notes about the garden. Then one entry stopped them both cold. Carol had written that I'd quietly taken out a second mortgage on the house to cover the down payment on Gary's first car repair shop, and made me swear never to tell him, because Gary would never have accepted the money if he'd known where it came from. Gary went white, reading it. He told me business loans were just easier to get than I thought, he said quietly. He never said a word about the house. Michelle turned another page and found an entry about her own bankruptcy filing 4 years back. How I'd cashed out most of my pension early to cover her legal fees, and told the kids we'd simply decided to downsize and travel less. I thought we actually just wanted a smaller house, she said, hand pressed over her mouth. They kept reading, entry after entry. Me picking up weekend security shifts at the freight yard for 2 full years, not out of boredom, the way I'd told everyone, but because Gary's shop had nearly folded during a slow winter and needed a cash cushion to survive. Me putting off a knee replacement I badly needed because Michelle's youngest was starting braces that same year and the timing never seemed right. Me skipping our 35th anniversary trip to Cape Cod, the one Carol had dreamed about for a decade, because tuition for my grandson's private school came due that same month and there wasn't enough left over for both. Never once complaining. Never once asking either of them to pay any of it back. Then Michelle found an entry from only 7 weeks earlier and read it aloud, her voice cracking apart halfway through. Carol had written about the hospice, about how I'd emptied nearly everything left in our joint savings account, without a moment's hesitation to make sure she had a private room and round-the-clock care, how I'd smiled while signing the paperwork so she wouldn't see what it actually cost either of us. She'd ended that entry hoping that if she didn't make it, her children would never mistake my quietness for indifference, because underneath it was the biggest heart she'd ever known in this life. Gary sat down hard on the arm of the couch, elbows on his knees, shoulders shaking. I thought Dad was just careful with money, he said. So did I, Michelle answered. Neither of them had ever once wondered why I still drove a 19-year-old pickup truck, or why I wore the same brown coat every winter for a decade, or why I always said things were doing just fine whenever anybody asked. Acceptance, it turns out, takes far less effort than curiosity ever does. If you've ever discovered too late exactly how much somebody quietly gave up so you could have an easier life, you already know that no apology feels big enough to undo that kind of blindness. That's not guilt talking either. That's just grief, running out of anywhere left to go. Around noon, Gary's wife Priya arrived with sandwiches from the deli down the street and immediately sensed something in the house had shifted. She read 2 pages of one notebook and sat down beside her husband without saying a single word. I told him Uber's $12, Gary said quietly, staring at nothing. My mother had just died and I told my own father Uber's $12. Across the city, I was sitting alone on a bench near the old Lackawanna River Trail, the same stretch Carol used to walk every spring when the dogwoods came in, saying it reminded her that life always finds a way of carrying somebody home eventually. My phone rang. This time, for the first time in 2 days, I actually answered it. For several long seconds, Gary couldn't get a single word out. Finally, through what sounded like real tears, 4 words. Dad, please come home. Words I would have given almost anything to hear 48 hours earlier. Words that arrived a little too late to feel the way they should have felt. I didn't yell at him. I didn't ask what had suddenly changed his mind, because by then I already knew. I just told him I wasn't ready yet, and I ended the call, not to punish him, but because some hearts genuinely need room to breathe before they can hold forgiveness, without collapsing under the weight of it too fast. I spent the rest of that afternoon walking the river trail alone. Fishermen cast their lines off the old railroad bridge. A group of kids chased a dog along the bank like nothing in the world had changed, because for them, nothing had. Carol used to say the world keeps turning whether or not the rest of us feel ready to keep walking alongside it. That afternoon, I honestly wasn't sure I still remembered how. Teresa called again that evening, not for an interview this time, she said up front, just to relay that the mayor's office wanted to recognize me publicly, and so did the Volunteer Fire Association, and so did Desmond's family personally. I told her I wasn't interested in any of that. She said she understood completely. But she had one more request. She wanted to tell the story accurately, because every station in 3 counties was already calling me a hero and inventing their own reasons for why I'd been standing alone at that garage in the first place. They don't need to know the rest of it. I told her. I think maybe they do, she said gently. Loneliness is something a lot more people understand than heroism ever will. Then she told me, quietly, that her own mother had died alone in a care facility during the pandemic, and that she'd never gotten the chance to say a proper goodbye either. Neither of us said anything for a while after that. I agreed to one interview. No politics, no dramatic background music, and if I didn't want to answer a question, I didn't have to. She agreed to all three conditions without hesitation. We filmed it the next morning in a quiet conference room at the hospital where Desmond was recovering. Just 2 chairs and 1 camera between us. She asked why I'd run back for that second extinguisher when the first one clearly wasn't enough. I told her that after 41 years of loving one person completely, fear stops mattering the way it used to. You stop asking whether something is dangerous and start asking only whether somebody still needs you standing there. Then she asked the question I'd known was coming from the moment she walked back into my life. Did my own children know I was flying home alone that night? I had every reason in the world, right there on camera, to tell the entire truth, to let an audience of who knew how many judge my son and daughter the exact same way I judged them alone in a motel room 2 nights earlier. Instead, I said, they've got a lot on their plates right now. I told her Gary was building a business from nothing, and Michelle was raising 3 kids, mostly on her own since her divorce, and juggling more than I ever had to manage at their age. So of course, I said, they couldn't just drop everything. Teresa studied me for a long moment. You don't sound angry at all, she said. I've had enough sadness this week already, I told her. I didn't feel like adding anger to the pile. That single sentence, they've got a lot on their plates, is the one that ended up everywhere afterward. Not the fire, not the extinguisher, not even the truck driver's recovery. That sentence, because apparently close to 100,000 people recognized themselves in it immediately. One woman commented that her own son said almost that exact phrase every single time he forgot her birthday. Someone else wrote that they'd called their father that same night for the first time in 8 months. If you've ever caught yourself quietly making excuses for somebody who let you down simply because you love them too much to say the truth out loud in front of strangers, then you already understand exactly why that sentence landed the way it did. Gary watched the interview alone in his office and put his face in both hands. Michelle watched it from her couch while her youngest daughter climbed up beside her and asked, completely innocently, why Grandpa was saying such nice things about the people who'd hurt his feelings. Michelle didn't have an answer for her. Most adults wouldn't have one either. That night, my porch quietly filled with casseroles and handwritten cards from neighbors I hadn't spoken to in years. Somebody mowed my lawn without ringing the doorbell first. Somebody else raked the leaves off Carol's rose beds. Nobody announced any of it. They just helped, the same way I'd apparently been quietly helping that same neighborhood for 3 decades, without anybody quite noticing until now. When I finally drove myself home that night, 2 folding chairs sat waiting on the porch. Gary in one, Michelle in the other. Neither one of them looking at a phone. Neither of us moved for a long moment once I stepped out of the truck. I want to slow down here, because I think this is actually the part of the story that matters more than any of the rest of it. Gary stood up first and asked if he could carry Carol's duffel bag inside for me, and it struck me right then that the last time he'd carried a bag of mine anywhere, he'd been maybe 11 years old. Michelle said she'd made coffee using Carol's old recipe, and it didn't come out tasting quite right. We both laughed about that together, and it was the first real, easy laugh either of us had managed since the funeral. Inside, the kitchen counter was covered in casseroles and sympathy cards from people I barely remembered meeting over the years. Gary finally admitted, straight out, that they'd found the notebooks. I told him I'd known that day would come eventually, one way or another. He asked if I'd let them find it on purpose. I told him it belonged to their mother, and it was never mine to keep hidden from her own children forever. We sat at the kitchen table where Carol had hosted 39 Thanksgivings. No television, no phones, just coffee going cold between 3 people finally willing to say the hard things out loud to each other's faces. Gary asked why I never told him about the second mortgage. I told him that helping him wasn't supposed to become another weight he had to carry on top of everything else. Michelle asked why I let her believe we'd simply chosen to downsize and travel less. I told her Carol wanted her to keep her dignity after the bankruptcy. Nothing more complicated than that. Then Gary asked the question that had clearly been sitting on him since the interview aired. Why hadn't I told the truth on camera? Why hadn't I let the world see exactly what they'd both said to me the night their mother died? I told him that public humiliation doesn't heal a private wound, and that Carol never once believed in exposing people just to watch them squirm for it afterward. Accountability, she used to tell me, should lead somewhere. It shouldn't just leave people standing broken on the other side of it with nowhere left to go. Michelle asked quietly if I'd actually been angry with them. I told her of course I had been. She said I hadn't looked angry at all on camera. I told her that 41 years of marriage teaches a man that speaking while you're still furious just hands you a second mess to clean up tomorrow morning. A few days later, the three of us drove out to the small memorial garden overlooking the river where Carol's ashes had been placed. Exactly the way she'd asked for years before any of us thought we'd actually need to honor that request. Gary apologized quietly to a headstone. Michelle said she'd forgotten how much I'd been caring for both of them, silently, for years, without either of them noticing. I told them that most of parenting is teaching your children how to walk, and that the hardest lesson left over after that is teaching them how to walk back toward you when they need to. Gary broke down completely then, and it wasn't the stiff, quick hug grown sons give their fathers out of habit at holidays. It was the kind of hug a frightened boy gives when he suddenly understands exactly how close he'd come to losing the one person who'd been quietly holding his entire life together the whole time without him ever noticing it. In the weeks that followed, Gary started showing up Tuesday mornings with 2 cups of coffee from the shop down the street, no particular reason given, just because he wanted to. Michelle came by Sunday evenings with soup that never quite tasted the way Carol's used to. She admitted she was missing some ingredient she couldn't place. I told her the ingredient was patience, and Carol had always said that one wasn't optional in this family. My grandson, Miles, wandered into the garage one Saturday afternoon and asked if I could teach him how to build something with his hands. We spent the whole afternoon on a lopsided little toolbox, and when he apologized for how crooked the corners turned out, I told him families are rarely perfectly built either, but if the foundation underneath is solid, they still stand up just fine through anything. A month later, the Volunteer Fire Association asked me to speak at a community safety event downtown. I almost said no. Then I remembered Carol telling me once, years ago, that if your own hard experience can help even one other person, it stops belonging just to you. So I said yes. And near the end of it, somebody in the crowd asked what made me run toward that burning truck instead of away from it like everybody else had. I told them my wife had spent 6 weeks quietly teaching me that when somebody's fighting for their life right in front of you, you stop waiting around for somebody else to be the one who shows up. The mistake most families make isn't one big dramatic betrayal. It's 1,000 small postponements, an unanswered text, a canceled visit, the quiet assumption that there's always going to be another chance to make things right later. Sometimes there isn't. If there's one thing I genuinely ask you to actually do today, and not just think about, it's this. Call whoever it is you've been meaning to call. Not next week. Today. And ask yourself honestly, is there somebody in your own life you've quietly assumed will simply always be there whenever you finally get around to it? I'd really love to hear from you in the comments tonight. If you think I was right to protect my children on camera, tell me that. If you think the truth deserved to come out completely, tell me that instead. And if you're honestly torn right down the middle the way I still am some nights, say that too. Tell me where you're watching this from tonight and what time it is where you are, because it always amazes me how many different corners of this country end up sitting quietly with me in this same moment. And if any part of tonight's story reminded you of your own family, of your own mother, your own father, your own quiet phone that didn't ring when it should have, I'd love to hear that from you as well. If this one meant something to you, stay a little while longer and consider subscribing, because I've got more stories like this one waiting, about the quiet sacrifices we don't ever seem to notice until it's almost too late to say thank you for them. Until next time, take care of the people who are still around to hear you say it, and don't wait for a headline to remind you exactly who's been carrying you all along.